Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about the integration of meaning. There's also a few announcements, but I'll leave those until the end. So, as some of you may know, I've recently been away in Italy. So I spent about 3 weeks wandering around Italy, looking at pictures mainly, or art. And that really, well, one of the main reasons I went to Italy was because of art, because of my relationship to art. And yeah, for me, experience of the arts has been really important for a lot of my life. So when I first went to university, I was studying English literature, for example, and I'm also a classical pianist. But it's only really, I think, engaging in middle way philosophy that I began to be able to articulate why I felt the arts were so important in people's lives. So that's really where the integration of meaning comes in, I think, as an aspect of practice. So I really think that the framework offered by the idea of integration, if you apply it in an appropriate way to meaning, can help us to better explain, well, why the arts and also a lot of other activities actually are important and can contribute to us making better judgments in our lives. So it's not just that we get a certain maybe deep satisfaction out of the arts, that's really important too, of course, but also that they're helpful to us. So to get a grip on this, I think we need to start with the idea of meaning. And my understanding of meaning has been very much shaped by the embodied meaning thesis, as I prefer to call it. Another term that you'll often find for it is cognitive linguistics, although I think in some ways that's not very descriptive of what it is.
Cognitive linguistic.
Yeah. So the work really particularly of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. So that's the pair of thinkers, linguists, and, well, one's a linguist, the other's a philosopher, who started their work in the 1980s. But yeah, I'm not going to say an awful lot about them in this talk, but that forms an important background, really. So more details of that approach you can get from their works. Okay, so meaning in this embodied way that they help to explain it's a process of making connections in response to symbols due to association. So as we go through our lives, we make more and more associations between different things. So yeah, just associations between one object and another, or not one person and another, but particularly between symbols and experiences. Symbols are simply types of experiences, you could say, but they're often objects. For example, a particular tree could be symbolic for you. You pass it every day and you like it for a particular reason. Or images or sounds, obviously tunes, but particularly words can be symbols. And they all have associations for us which are meaningful. We tend to have certain experiences when we encounter those symbols, which remind us maybe of experiences we've had in the past. And obviously, to start with, in our infancy, this is all rather vague, but it gradually becomes more and more clarified and more precise as we develop. And again, Lakoff and Johnson can help to explain how that works, which is obviously quite complex. But I think the key thing for our purposes really is that meaning is an experience. So we experience understanding in the broadest sense of the word. So understanding fits very well, the idea of understanding fits very well with meaning, because it has both a cognitive and an emotive sense. So cognitive meaning is what you could look up in a dictionary. Emotive meaning is, a connection you might make with a person, say, or with a poem or something like that. So making a connection emotionally and understanding cognitively are inseparable in our experience, because they both involve making connections. So we can experience how they're connected, but also you can explain this in neural terms as well. So when we make these connections, those connections are synaptic. They occur in our brains. And one of the sort of 3 to 5 billion, I believe, synaptic connections that typically occur in our brains. So this immensely complex set of connections, a system that exists in the brain. So when we make associations, those connections are made or activated or strengthened, and energy flows through those channels created by those connections. So when energy flows through them, that helps to establish the connections. And that, of course, is integrated with responses in our whole body. So it's not just about the brain, it's about the rest of the body too. And the kinds of meaning we experience obviously affect our body. So something that's a threat, for example, might make us tense our bodies. So meaning is something that affects the whole of us, but can be triggered and is associated with symbols. Now, that's basically a quick version of the embodied understanding of meaning. But in our culture, in the West particularly, we have a long history of entrenched what I would call representationalism. So representationalism is just a handy word really for a range of theories that are widely assumed about meaning. In this way of understanding meaning is assumed to derive from our relationship with reality in some sense, a relationship of basically sentences or propositions with reality. So it could be a hypothetical relationship, or it could be a one-to-one relationship, but in some way or other, that's where meaning is taken to come from. So what that means is that meaning is assumed to come from our beliefs or our possible beliefs, rather than from a more basic bodily experience. And neurally, that would mean that meaning is the property of a certain small dominant part of our brain, so the left prefrontal cortex, which forms propositions, which are beliefs, which we take to represent the world. And in that way of thinking about meaning, it's cognitive meaning is kind of the real meaning, and emotive meaning is kind of second class meaning. So I think that flies in the face of what we can understand about not just our experience, but also the body, and indeed a lot of scientific evidence. But it seems to be an awfully slow process for even academic thinking, let alone wider thinking, to adapt to the embodied nature of meaning, and to really take on board the implications of the cognitive and the emotive being inseparable from each other. Obviously it becomes more complex to explain when you're talking about complex abstract language, so like a academic paper about physics or something like that. People think about that as a set of representations of how things are, not as something you have feelings about that make it meaningful. But you still have emotive meaning involved in your reading of even something like that. Basically, you couldn't make sense of it if you weren't interested in it. So its embodied processes are still required, even for the most abstract kinds of meaning. So if we don't separate the cognitive from the emotive, but always try and bear in mind their relationship, hopefully we can stop overestimating the independence concepts from bodily states, which is what we often tend to do, I think. And that also means facts are always related to values. Now, so that's the kind of understanding of meaning which I'm relying on when talking about the integration of meaning. Now, for meaning to become integrated and for the integration of meaning to be a practice, we also need to think about how meaning might need, or why meaning might need integrating. And that's obviously because it's separated. Now, with the other kinds of meaning, with belief and desire, in the other talks in this series 3, I've talked about conflict, conflict of desire, we'll talk about conflict of belief as needing to be resolved by integration. And you think about the two mules, obviously there's a conflict there which is resolved by an integration process. With meaning, it's not quite like that, because two different meanings are not in conflict. You know, if you've got one person, for example, speaking Japanese and another speaking English, they're not in conflict. That's because they have completely don't understand each other. You know, so but the separation between them, you could describe. I prefer to describe as fragmentation. Yeah, so if there's a lack of connection, a lack of understanding, then I would describe that as fragmentation of meaning. So fragmentation happens when different systems of meaning are not in contact with each other in a particular personal situation where that's important. So, for example, you're with somebody that it might be important to connect with emotionally, but you don't really understand what they're on about. You don't connect with what they're saying. So that's a primarily emotive fragmentation, but it could also be a cognitive one to some extent. Or within ourselves, so we can forget what we can learn from our past experiences and past states. Yeah, so we might have had a bad experience with making a certain mistake in the past, but if we don't remember it, we don't sort of communicate with that past experience. Then there's a fragmentation there which is stopping us from integrating that experience. So fragmentation of meaning may be sometimes due to failure of communication, either externally or internally, but it's not the same as communication. So communication depends on shared meaning, but meaning is a more basic experience that needs to be there for communication to take place on both sides. And there's also a lot of connection, I think, between meaning and compassion. So compassion is emphasized a lot in Buddhism and in other contexts as well. And I think it makes a lot of sense to think of compassion as developing meaning in relation to a person, what a person means to you. So it's about your response to them and the impression they are making on you and the connections you are making through that response. When meaning is fragmented, it doesn't necessarily cause conflict, but integrating meaning is a prior condition for integrating beliefs. So before you can understand, before you can reconcile an opposing belief, somebody who disagrees with you or even is even hostile to you, before you can reconcile, you have to understand each other. So understanding is like a step which is required before reconciliation. An understanding means both that we need to understand their symbols cognitively, but also that we need to engage with them, to be interested in them. So the more integrated our meaning is in ourselves, the more effectively we can understand the world and others. So conflict can obviously be due to misunderstanding sometimes, but it can also be due to a failure to empathize, and often those things are very difficult to totally distinguish from each other. How they're distinguished is a matter of degree. So integrating meaning is a process, is a practice, and how we often talk about it, I think, is we talk about learning, we talk about understanding, maybe we talk about relating or recalling. All of those processes, I think, are making new associations, new links of some kind, or renewing ones we've got already. They're strengthening connections of some kind or another, associative connections. And that helps to set up the conditions for us to become more integrated and to both individually and socially. So how we do that, some basic ways I think is that we can extend the stock of symbols we have, so we can learn more in effect, and that makes us more flexible in the ways we can think and the ideas we can have. So it allows us to understand and express new areas. So we can, anything from learning, basically understanding the psychology of somebody else, say, to help us understand them, to learning a language which would enable you to understand what somebody else is saying more cognitively. Also, I think the practice of integrating meaning can be helped by tolerating ambiguity in many cases. So there are many areas where tolerating ambiguity prevents us from immediately recoiling from some sort of opposition, where it helps us to engage with things. And poetry and humor, are particular points of ways of helping us tolerate ambiguity. So humor can, think of the way that humor can ease a tense situation, for example. But also sometimes we need to clarify for practical purposes. We might need to create a shared understanding of symbols in a particular context. So if you're about to do a practical task with somebody, you have to clarify what you're talking about and agree about it before you can do that task together. And also sometimes symbols have a longer term importance, I think, in inspiring us. So they remind us of our longer term intentions and potentials. So that's where I talk about archetypes, which I think are a special type of symbol, which has the function of inspiring us in the long term. Again, I'm not going to say a lot about that now, but it fits in with the general picture of integrating meaning, I think. So broadly speaking, there's a range of practices that can help us with integrating meaning, but particularly the arts, because I think the arts generally extend our symbols. They help us tolerate ambiguity, and sometimes they also help us clarify, and they help inspire us. So there are lots of different kinds of ways the arts can help us to integrate meaning, but also education generally, learning foreign languages, humor I've already mentioned, communication, sometimes ritual, and some meditation practices. So the practice of focusing, for example, is about focusing in on meaning in your specific experience. So Jen Lin, who started the practice of focusing, has written a lot of interesting stuff about meaning, actually, and the way in which meaning is found in our experience. Anyway, I'd better stop there. Yeah, let's have a bit of space for questions and thoughts.
Just checking back with you, Robert, did you use the term left representationalism at the beginning of the talk?
I used the term representationalism, and I may have mentioned the left prefrontal cortex.
Yes, you did both. You did both. Okay. And did you link those to Western thinking?
I did link them, yes. So
yes, I'm just checking back. That's all, just in case, because I'm a bit hard of hearing sometimes. Just wanted to check back. on
Sure,
that. Thank you.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the link was basically the representationalism assumes that the functions which take place in the left prefrontal cortex are the ones of meaning, rather than them being more broadly distributed in our brains and bodies indeed. I realise there's quite a lot of stuff here in this particular topic. So yeah, do ask if you need clarification apart from anything else. Mark, yes.
Yeah, I have a question about what was just mentioned again. I really like how you showed in your video also representational thinking being top down and involving the left cortex more. And the bottom up, Lakoff, Johnson, embodied cognition or meaning, embodied meaning finding. So would that involve more right cortex, the more holistic, as McGilchrist's book elucidates in great detail, the more holistic functions of the right hemisphere?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it involves processes that are more associated with the right hemisphere. And McGilchrist talks, for example, about how the right hemisphere deals with what we get from our senses, but it also deals with metaphor. So, you know, the finding wider links between different experiences meaningful, I think, seems to come more from the right hemisphere. And so if you haven't got this sort of overriding dominant assumption that your represented beliefs are the whole story, then you're more open to those influences from the right.
And to follow up on that, since the middle way idea comes from Buddhism, is there more of that right hemisphere openness or contextuality or holistic awareness in the Buddhist tradition than in the Western Christian tradition, in your view?
I think there are a lot of practices that can help with it, certainly. So meditation practice is the most obvious one. Whether the culture as a whole does that is another question. But certainly, I think if we stick with the practices, there's an awful lot of very helpful stuff available in the Buddhist tradition that we can draw on.
Certainly worth making a bit of a plug for Eugene Jundlin's focusing book, very cheap paperback, which really does make a lot of sense out of the problems of left representationalism, and it makes the practice of finding meaning in embodiment much easier to understand. Very straightforward book and very cheap. Just put in the plug for it. You did mention it, so I thought I'd put the plug in for the literature.
Yes, I mean, also in the festival we had in April, which was videoed, there is a focusing session which you could watch over introduction to focusing, by a focusing teacher. Okay, any other questions? Vijay?
Yeah, are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yeah, in your wide reading, I imagine you've come across the Santiago theory of cognition, and those two, the experts who developed that, make a similar study of organisms right down to the very simplest level in terms of learning, that any learning involves a modification of the being of that animal. And it could be through synapses or whatever, but learning was a modification. It wasn't simply a some sort of brain function, but you might say with your the theory you've just spelled out that that's what's happening, the synapse connections. I'm wondering if you've connected those things in your studies.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't claim that it's always just the brain. It's just that it seems to be primarily in humans. Yeah, I suppose my only reservation about this is Maturana and Varela, their take on this is just that they use this word cognition, and so it seems to be that they don't make a distinction between meaning and knowledge, which I think is indeed belief.
That's what I was wondering. Learning and meaning for them might be equivalent. Well, no, I mean not. I mean they seem to be equivalent in the way you've spelled it out in terms of making these connections. Yeah.
Well, I think that the most important aspect of learning is making meaning connections, which is not necessarily the same as forming beliefs. Forming beliefs is a further stage, let alone knowledge, which is another thing altogether. So I would be sort of much happier with what Maturana and Varela say if they made that distinction. But there's an awful lot of good stuff there as well, I think, in understanding particularly the relationship between organisms and sort of the process of finding things meaningful. I would call it finding things meaningful. They talk more in terms of knowledge, but the way in which that comes from activity in relation to our environment and this gradual or making of connections in response to our environment.
So where would you put information just at the bottom of like raw sense input, and that knowledge or learning as a way of dealing with that information somehow?
I'd be more inclined to I'm not sure about the idea of raw sense input really, because sense input depends on what we make of it and how we format it as well. But I think there are, what for humans anyway, are experiences, and we make associations on the basis of those experiences, which I would call meaning. And then there's this more sort of specialized process whereby we form those meanings into beliefs, which we use for practical purposes. I mean, that's what makes the difference between meaning and belief. That beliefs are, I mean, sometimes they're explicit, sometimes they're what we would say we believe, but sometimes also they're implicit. They're the basis on which we act, what you would assume we believe from how we act. But either way, it's been entrenched in our meaning systems, if you like, in a way that enables us to act on it. It's firm enough for us to act on it. And then, but as for knowledge, well, I don't believe in knowledge really. So that's a further step, I think, from belief, the idea that belief can be accurate in some sense.
Could it be that information is a cultural thing then, and knowledge is a cultural thing? You're talking about something, I suppose, individual and personal.
Yes, well, I think it's cultural as well, but the cultural stuff is dependent on, obviously, the functioning of us as organisms. So it's dependent on our brains and bodies, so we make connections socially and culturally through symbols and the interaction between those symbols and our brains and bodies.
Might it be true to advance the idea that the left representationalism that features in Western thinking treats learning as adding to? Learning something means adding to the body of knowledge in a very mechanical representation idea of the learning is out there and we put it in to ourselves, or we add it to ourselves, or we break through to something, or we break away from something. And these representations of mechanical putting in, taking out, raising up, lowering down, these have to be left behind, perhaps, if we are to understand what meaning, embodied meaning, means and how it works, because it seems to me that it may be an innate process, a function of the right hemisphere of our brains in conjunction with the left, It may be an inherent process which we have to give way to, and abandon some of our ideas about how we make progress, how we learn. Yeah.
Indeed, yeah. I think this is a major difficulty in the way education is often thought about. It's thought about primarily as knowledge, in knowledge terms.
Adding to,
yeah. Whereas if we thought about it in meaning terms, it could be much more effective.
The building blocks of information.
Yeah. Bridget.
Yeah, it's nearly like with us, we would look at Macho and Varela like from a very structuralist, determinist way, moving from the structuralist, exactly how Pete's describing it. You pour knowledge in a mechanical age, like we've lived in a mechanical age, to moving to, for me, the post-structuralists, where we are meaning-making beings. And of course, in my profession, that's what I'm always doing, is embodied meaning. It's like making connections and having what maybe Bateson would describe as the news of difference. And so you integrate the newses of difference in order to reduce the anxiety and the ambiguity, but we're meaning-making beings, much more than structural determinism. We're social beings that create meaning, and out of that meaning we create truths, and then the truths become conflictual, and then we hit a crisis where we actually have to integrate how do we go ahead. I mean, that's just from like people like Derrida. I'm looking at language more, how we create meaning through language.
Yeah, there are lots of connections with obviously a whole variety of thinkers there, but I mean, I do have some issues with that use of the term truth, I have to say, but beliefs would fit there just as well, or better, I think. But we form beliefs out of meanings, and then yes, those beliefs can conflict, which is where the integration process becomes important. But you can't really engage with that process unless the meaning has been integrated first. We've got some basis on which to do so. But I mean, I suppose I've had different impressions of what people mean when they say things like we're meaning-making beings, in that sometimes that seems to be about meaning as a sort of overall belief about the significance of life. That sense that when people talk about the meaning of life, actually they don't seem to me to be talking about meaning at all, in my sense. No, they're talking about beliefs that they think it would be good to have, which explain everything, which I'm not sure they're going to find. But so
it's more that we create meaning in groups. So we have a creation story which gives us meaning.
Yeah.
They used to always be stories until they were turned into mechanical truths.
Yeah.
So we create it together.
Yeah, I mean, we can create meaning in groups, but I think that's interdependent with what we do as individuals as well. We create meaning through our development of meaning in ourselves to make that possible, to make the cultural resources helpful to us.
Really interesting.
Yeah, perhaps we better stop there. So I'll stop